Okay, I mean, we've got a few people here. I suggest we just kick off.
Sounds good.
So this is kind of a small workshop, really. It's just, I wanted to cover producing icons for digital platforms, because I've just noticed a few issues, not necessarily with lab stuff at all, but just generally. And I saw it as an opportunity to sort of, I don't know, go over some aspects of icon design that might not be that well known to people, especially those who aren't visual designers or front-end developers. So I'll kick off. So the issue really is threefold, and you'll have seen this on various digital platforms, and especially on intranets, which are sort of notoriously poorly put together and have low attention to detail when it comes to stuff like this. And those issues are, we see blurry icons, we see inconsistent icon sizing, and also inconsistent icon styles. Because people have just grabbed icons from wherever, and as new features get added down the road, there's no consistent approach to icons in place. So new icons are just added ad hoc to the product, and it ends up becoming a bit of a mess. I thought I'd just touch on the different types of icons to start. So, and I've put them into three groups. So the first type are UI icons. And by UI icons, I mean icons that generally stand up on their own without labels, that are just, they're so well established that they don't need explanation. They don't need labels or tooltips. So things like the search icon, the hamburger menu, home icon, and things like, chevrons and carrots and that kind of stuff. Just the very well accepted icon furniture or UI furniture. And then the next sort of level up above those, if you like, are product icons. And product icons are generally unique to that platform and really require a bit more explanation. They require a label, because it's not always, they're slightly ambiguous, basically, and it's not always apparent what they refer to. So although we can come up with a nice kind of approximation, and something that seems to make sense to users, they might not make sense. So we generally need to have labels. And then the level above those, which we won't be talking about much today, are pictograms. So these aren't really icons. This is moving towards illustrations, and you might use these for sort of onboarding and modals and stuff, where you just want to decorate the UI a bit, make it feel a bit more polished. And they're just sort of adding that joy or whatever to the product. But the ones we're going to focus on really are product icons, but also UI icons. And in reference to that label question, this is what Nielsen Norman Group have to say, who are obviously the experts in usability. They think that a text label must be present alongside an icon to clarify its meaning. And that icon labels should be visible at all times without any interaction from the user. So of course, that could be quite challenging when we're trying to cram quite a lot of icons into a UI. Adding a label to those, you almost think, well, what's the purpose of the icon? But I think it's just something to consider. You wouldn't always follow these guidelines. This is for kind of 100% usability, to make something as usable as possible. Sometimes we'll sacrifice a bit of usability because we think there's some inherent learnability to the UI, and that people will understand what these icons mean over time. But we should at least have tooltips. But actually, they suggest that we shouldn't have tooltips because it's an extra interaction. So there's a link to that, by the way, and I'll share this this presentation afterwards so people can go and visit those and have a bit of a read, because there's quite a lot of information on icons and their approach to them. And I just thought it was quite interesting. I was thinking about the history of icons, and pre-digital, we had icons, and the earliest example I could think of, and I'm sure they go way back, like the power icon on your TV has been around for decades. But on an old tape deck, you had these established icons, and it's interesting that here they do have labels. But I think in this example on the right, without those labels above, we'd all understand those. And we still use those in Spotify and VOD services and what have you. So they're fully established, but icons go back pre-digital, and so do icon labels. So I guess the next question is, when we're building a product or feature, where do we source our icons from? Now, if we don't have an established icon library, which ideally we will have at some point, that would be the ultimate goal. There's a few sources that I use. I actually use Icons 8 because I pay for that. It's a paid service. It looks like this, and they've got thousands of icons that are really well rendered, fully searchable, all different styles, iOS, Windows, Android. But there's also Noun Project, which is free, and then I think Flat Icon's free as well. Those are 3 good ones. I know there are more, and people might have their own preference. But the better the original source, the sort of less work you have to do later to get them into your product and make them render nicely. So my preference is Icons 8. It'd be great if we actually had that as something that we could access, paid for by Lab. Yvonne, nudge, nudge. But we'll see. Like I say, I've been using this for years, and again, you can. I haven't put a link in here, but you can just Google that and find that. And they have a great web interface. They also have an app you can download. The nice thing about these is that you can drag them as SVGs straight into Sketch or Figma or whatever, and they'll be nice and crisp. And I always do a bit more work to them generally, because you don't just want to use Windows 10 icons on your platform, but you pick the set that you feel suits either the existing icon set or the aesthetic you're going for, and then you might tweak them slightly. And we'll get into that in a minute. So here it is, refining icons. So the point here is that icons from online resources are not necessarily ready, and they may need some extra work. And that work really consists of making sure they fit on a 1 pixel and 8 pixel grid. Make sure they're simplified, because some icons can be overly complex, and when they're viewed at small sizes, simplicity is key. And making sure they're consistent across the product. So there may be already icons in the product, and if you're adding new icons, we want to make sure that they feel like part of the same set. And to that end, I've created this icon template. This is based on Google material, but I tweaked it slightly, and I may have to zoom in here a bit for people. So the point here is that we have icon templates of 3 sizes: 32 pixels, 24 pixels, 16 pixels. They all fit on our 8 pixel grid, which I sort of delved into a bit on the previous presentation. And I guess the key thing here, I'll just zoom in a little bit, and you can see that there's some nice guidelines in here, and I'll explain how those work. But when we're refining icons, we tend to use these to help us make sure they're consistent. So circular icons would ideally all sit on that circle, and therefore viewed as a set, they'd feel consistent. Same with square icons, portrait, landscape, that kind of thing. So these guides are actually really helpful. I'll zoom out again. And here's an example of why we need those 3 distinct sizes. So this is a 32 pixel icon, and I'll just zoom in a bit more. Nice and big, and we can see that this is on the pixel grid. So this is the 1 pixel grid. And we know that this is going to render really nicely because there's nothing on sub-pixel lines. So when this renders in a browser or whatever, it's going to be nice and crisp. Now, what tends to happen is people will then just refactor that icon for these different sizes just by scaling it, which is what I've done here. This is a master, and these are just scaled down to 24 and 16. If I turn on, and you can do that up here in Figma, and you can do it in Sketch 2, pixel preview, that's actually showing how it's going to render. Because obviously without using pixel preview, we're cheating, we're rendering on sub-pixels. And we can see that 32 pixel is nicely on the pixels, so it's nice and crisp. But as soon as we get down to these smaller sizes, we get this horrible anti-aliasing. And when you get down to 16 pixels, they become very blurry. So scaling icons like that does not work. I'm going to leave the grid on actually. So here we can see I've got 3 sets. These are no longer locked to that master. This is still scaled, but what I'm going to do is just quickly show how we would make this work at 16 pixels. And I won't spend too long on this because it'll be a bit boring. But it is a little bit of pixel work. Whoops, it's a bit of grabbing points. Sorry, it's early morning here, so I'm being a bit clumsy. And you can see immediately the effect that's having. So there's a little bit of work to do when we want to refactor icons to different sizes. We have to kind of bear this in mind and make sure that we're using, we're not using subpixels. I'll quickly just do this top bit, but I think everyone gets the idea now.
Hey, James, while you're doing that, do you happen to know if Figma has an equivalent of the round to nearest pixel feature that Sketch has?
Do you know what? I don't know. That's a good question, because I guess you could just run that on this and it would snap or try to snap them to those points, correct?
It's an interesting thing that Sketch does. Yeah, you can select the individual anchors and then run a command called round to nearest pixel, and it will do its best to snap all the anchor points to sit on a full pixel. It's not perfect by any means, but it can be a nice way to quickly at least get everything snapped, and then maybe you have to adjust a handful of anchor points.
Yeah, so that's a great point. I mean, you have snap to pixel grid, which you can see is working there. They're snapping, and I'm not getting decimals up here. But yeah, there might be a plugin that does that. But yeah, Sketch makes that a lot easier, it sounds like. I haven't used Sketch for a while.
I think that Figma actually does include that now. It's under the Arrange menu.
Oh, is it? There you go.
Try it on your 16.
Oh, round to pixel. So let's just try that. Let's try it on this.
Yeah, I don't think it works at a pixel by pixel level, though. It's more like it's trying to snap like a square, I think.
It's done. It did that one a bit.
Oh,
sort of.
Kind of.
Sort of. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how the selection. It's not doing it now at that level. Maybe at this level. There might be a plugin that helps with that. Yeah, it's kind of trying. It is kind of doing it. I mean, that needs more work. I guess it makes it a bit quicker. Of course, down at 16 pixels, I've been using 2 pixel widths down here. Down at 16 pixel, we might go down to 1 pixel widths on the lines. That's just something else to bear in mind. And also, of course, I would probably be turning off the pixel preview, because I want to use these guides, to make sure, that this is sort of using those guides, if that makes sense. And it's nicely fitting inside this square. So I won't spend too much more time on this because I don't want to eat into Brian's stuff, but you can kind of get the idea. So that's what we need to do. We can't just scale icons is the sort of the main takeaway. We have to do a bit of work to get them rendering nicely at different sizes. And there we have it. And there's one using a 1 pixel line. You could even try a 2 pixel line on the calendar icon. It might be fine. You just have to simplify it a bit more, I think. And here's one I did earlier. This is an add user icon I created. And you can sort of see how this fits into this template as well. It's fitting within this kind of central square. It just helps me make it nice and balanced, nice and centered. And also, again, it would feel consistent with these other icons in terms of line width, height, and the kind of weight it has on the screen. That is it. I smashed through that. I knew it was going to be quite quick. I've got some resources here that I thought were really good. And again, when I share this, I put it in the chat for this. These are just 3 good guides, if you like, and resources on basically what I just covered in a bit more depth. So I recommend having a look at those as extra reading. But that I knew, like I say, I knew it was going to be short and sweet. That really is it. And the benefits will be just a better looking UI, more consistent, more polished, and also going forward, a consistent way to add more icons to the platform. You being a new designers into a platform on a new feature, you need to have that set up, I think, because how do you keep it consistent? You want to give them a nice framework to go forward, because they're invariably going to be adding, not always, but there's a good chance they're going to be adding new icons as part of their products. Maybe it's something in the menu that leads to it, or maybe it just needs some other UI icons. And I know currently, I think we use streamline icons is quite popular amongst lab projects I've seen, which is a good icon set. But again, I'd still want to go in and even on streamline icons, make sure they're rendering properly at these different sizes we might need them at. And those 3 different sizes, just quickly before I pass over to Brian, those 32, 24, and 16, you don't necessarily need all those sizes. Like I tend to do create most of my UIs using 32 pixel icons. And I can probably just go into a little bit more depth on this. This safe space, we've been on our icons getting too big in here, but we want a big enough sort of hit area for our mouse, for our cursor rather, and also when we're doing mobile work, we need like a safe touch area for our icons. I know iOS guidelines are 44 device pixels, I think. I think Android might be 48 or 40, I can't remember. So you want to lean towards that. I'd go to 32 because I want it to sit nicely on the 8 pixel. 40 would obviously sit on that too. So we don't want people to try and have to mouse over, you know, a small icon. We want them to give them a nice big area they can hit. But I think Brian will go into more depth on that and the implementation side of things. Yeah. So there you go. I'll pass it over. Thanks, guys.
All right. Perfect. So yeah, thanks, James. That was really great. I'm going to share my screen so that I can show kind of the other half of this equation. So James really showed you kind of how to create the icons, how to set up an icon set. And what I want to show is how you actually use those in an application. And there's a lot of different ways to do that. And I'll talk about some of those techniques. But what I really want to show more than anything else is kind of what you see in the browser and present some options for different ways of using icons that open up the possibility of doing different interesting things. So hopefully this will be really helpful for the designers and the engineers on the call. I also just want to say in general, James, for the things that I'm stepping through, it would be great for you to tie those concepts back to these slides. So feel free to call out kind of where you see those things. And then generally for everybody else on the call, I would love it if this were really interactive. So don't hold any questions that you might have or anything like that. I'm more than happy to do this in real time. So with that, I guess let's jump right into it. So what I had done is I set up this storybook. And I'm going to publish this, and hopefully we can make this open source too, so that everybody on the call now will be able to kind of see all of the code that's involved here. There's a simple introduction here, but I'm going to jump right into the first story, which is showing off some icons. And kind of the first thing that James talked about was what poorly drawn icons look like, meaning the anchor points aren't on a full pixel. It's really, really visible when you have straight lines like these icons that I quickly drew poorly in Sketch. And maybe zoomed out here, it's hard to tell, but if you do zoom in a little bit, and can everybody see my screen zoomed in?
No, that's not zooming.
It's not zooming? Oh, okay, maybe I can do this.
There you go, that works.
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, cool. So it's a little bit hard to tell just with the kind of the way that the browser is rendering this, but if you zoom in on your own, you'll see that the edges, or if you look really close to your monitor, the edges of these are actually quite blurry, and it's because they're not sitting on a full pixel. I can actually show you that in Sketch. Maybe it's a little bit more obvious, but you can see here that the edges of all of these are blurry, and like how James showed you in Figma, the edges of these are just kind of floating in space. They're not snapped to a full pixel on the grid. And you can see too, if you turn off the pixel preview, you kind of mask that issue. So all of this blurry stuff on the edge is actually what's being rendered right here. So this is an example of what happens when you have poorly drawn or incorrectly scaled icons. There's another section underneath here, which I was going to touch on Svgo a little bit later, but Svgo is a way for you to optimize your SVGs. Similar engineers would be familiar with like minifying JavaScript. It would be a similar concept. And in fact, this square icon is so poorly drawn that when you run it through Svgo, it comes out looking completely broken. So it's actually super blurry, and it ended up being a single line. And that's because I used a feature in Sketch that can't be optimized with Svgo, where this wasn't actually a square that was drawn with paths. It used a border inside of Sketch. And so what happens if you export this and then optimize it, the border will not be drawn correctly with the built-in SVG features, and it can come out looking broken like this. So I think this really illustrates what happens when you are not actually creating your icon files the correct way, or possibly if you are grabbing them from some third party and who knows how they were created to begin with, you could run into problems later on down the line. Another reason that I bring this up is in really sophisticated applications, this process might be automated. So you might not see the issues until you deploy your application, and your SVG assets could be automatically optimized, and you might run into weird little issues like this. By the way, SVG itself is really, really complex. There's a lot of features, and there's a lot of things that might work in design software that don't work so well in the browser. Certain types of gradients come to mind as a feature that's not super well supported in browsers. So it's definitely worth being aware of what's going to happen when you export your icons. The next page that I have on here is correctly drawn icons. So I know that zooming in doesn't really give you the best view, but if I come back to Sketch, you can see here that I drew up a very simple template. It's just a box, and my icons are now sitting on full pixels. This is what the icons actually look like in the browser if you were to zoom in all the way. And then again, I optimized those exact icons with Svgo, and you can see that they're still perfect. When we go into Svgo in a little bit more depth later, you'll see that the actual size of the SVG code is dramatically smaller with Svgo. And that's interesting. I'll talk a little bit about different ways to actually manage your SVG assets, because there's pros and cons to using them inline as they are done here. So I guess I'll just pause there for a moment just to check if there's any questions kind of about this. You could kind of see that, James was doing all of his icon creation in Figma, and I'm doing it in Sketch, but the results, the concepts are really, really similar. If not, I'll continue on diving into some of the alignment issues using the template, using the bounding box that James illustrated. What's interesting is that if you look here, I kind of drew up some icons, and it says that they're misaligned, but you'll notice that they look kind of fine. It's not obvious that there's actual alignment issues here, but if I turn on the bounding box, you can immediately see that there's all kinds of problems in here. This icon, for instance, has a very, very wide bounding box, and the diamond is kind of off-center to the top right. This square has a very, very tight bounding box. It was drawn too close. And so now the fitting inside of here is super tight. You'll notice that when you have these icons next to each other, on this edge, it's very, very close, but on this edge, it's far away. You might imagine, and I will illustrate that a little later, that can create problems down the line when you're using labels. You also have the same problem. Well, here's a better illustration without the bounding box. If I don't center align these, if I don't force them to be center aligned like this, the problems are immediately obvious. This might happen in a case where you're using icons inner interface and they're not center aligned intentionally. These problems can crop up. Obviously, this is pretty contrived. These are extreme. Oftentimes, you'll see icons that are off by maybe 1 or 2 pixels, but it's definitely noticeable in like a highly polished interface if something is off by just a little bit. Also wanted to show that these problems still arise if your icons are arranged vertically. So you could imagine in some menu somewhere where you're not horizontally centering these icons at all, these issues can still crop up. So it's really important to use some kind of template like James created so that your icons are actually centered in their bounding box and they have enough breathing room. They're not right up against the edge, so that when you are placing them next to other content, it feels too tight. Also, considering the different shapes that you have, here's an example of me drawing them poorly. You want to make sure that the icons are related to each other in the correct kind of proportions. And then the last story in here is using these with labels. And you can see it's relatively subtle, but if you really look at it, and here I have an 8-pixel grid on the background, you can tell that these things are not quite right. They are horizontally centered here, but the space between the icon and the text label is wildly inconsistent between all of these things. Again, this is pretty contrived, but if you are in a very sophisticated, very polished interface, this might be very, very obvious. So I guess I'll take another pause there just in case anyone has any questions or comments on this stuff before I go on to the different ways to actually use icons. All right, so lots of different ways that you can use icons, a lot of pros and cons, a lot of trade-offs here. One of the first ways that I'll show you is an Svg Sprite. And I'm sure most people, if you've been kind of doing web development for a while, might be familiar with the concept of sprites, where you take a whole bunch of image assets and you arrange them into a single image. And the idea there is, if you were doing, let's say, like a PNG sprite, you would download a single image one time, which would be the sprite. And even though that would be large, you would download it once and your browser could cache that. You can actually do the same thing with sprites. And I wanted to call out that this is actually a pretty popular technique. If you look at the newest version of Bootstrap, they now include a set of icons, and they actually provide a sprite. So here they're showing you some different ways to use that sprite, where this little bit of code in here references the sprite file, which is called bootstrap icons.svg, and then you have something called a fragment, which relates to an ID, which is an attribute elsewhere in the sprite file that uniquely identifies this particular icon. So here you can see heart fill, toggles, which is this right here, and shop, which is this icon right here. This is all one file. And you get the same benefits that you would get doing a raster image sprite, where you would download this single SVG file one time. The browser that the user is using could cache this individual file. So if other assets change, this would remain cached. And you would do that for performance reasons. One of the things that this little example doesn't show, even though the code is there, this property here, fill current color, is actually really interesting because it allows you to control the color of these icons based on the color of the typeface, the color property of the parent of this element. So I'm doing that here for this sprite. I made the heart red by setting the color of, I believe it's sitting in a div. The sprite is using current color, but you could do this if you are changing colors, or if you just want one section of your UI, let's say that it was using a brand color, or it was using a secondary or a tertiary color, your icons could follow the same exact color of your typefaces if you were using labels. So another technique here would be to reference an SVG externally. So this would be referencing the SVG file itself. I'll pull this up in the dev tools so you can get a look at actually what's going on here. And here you can see static media flow dot and then a little hash and then SVG. So this SVG file is kind of sitting by itself in the code base. I can show you exactly where that is here. Here's the flow SVG. Here you can see it's a single line of SVG code, but this is the actual file that I'm rendering over here. What's nice about this is that this is very easy to set up. If you can serve other images, any other static assets, it's very simple to incorporate this into your application. There's very little that you need to do. And in a later story, I'll actually show you that in the same way that I'm using an IMG tag here with a source, like you would any other image, you can also do this as a background image. One of the biggest reasons, again, that you would want to do this is because of the simplicity of setting it up. Here you go. You can see here I'm using this as a background, and this is the familiar CSS property background. And I'm doing the same thing. I'm using this URL, and then it points to this SVG file, which is sitting inside of this code base. This application is able to serve that file statically, which means I can request it by itself, and I can use it with CSS. This is really great. Again, incredibly simple, and it does give you some degree of control. So if you wanted to style this with CSS, it's quite easy and quite familiar. Here's another example of using other kind of background styling. So here in this case, I just made it huge. You can see here it's kind of centered and offset a little bit and scaled up to 1,000 pixels. The next way that you might want to use an SVG would be to use it inline. You'll notice that this looks exactly the same, but if we look at the code, it is quite different. Go down to this particular story, which I believe is over here. So here we have a bit of React code. This is part of Storybook, but you'll see right here that I have the SVG kind of directly in the document. And if I were to inspect and pull this up in the DevTools, it should be right here. Here you can see the actual SVG file itself. And here's where things actually get really, really interesting, because you can see this is just like any other DOM node. So here we can see a path, and here's another path. And what's interesting about this is you can style these, and you have all of the control that you have when you're using CSS. So if you wanted to, you can do interactive things. So if you hover, you can style these individual path nodes just like you would anything else on the page, which enables you to do really interesting effects like this. You might do something quite a lot simpler for your application icons, maybe a simple animation. Oftentimes you see like simple rotations on like chevron shapes or close icons for modal dialogues, but you do really have that full control, and it's not just colors. You can really do quite a lot. To show that off, I actually put together a simple SVG right here, and you can do much more complex kind of animations. So here I'm animating each one of these individually. I'm also changing their color. There's custom easing functions, all kinds of stuff that you might want to do in CSS. You can actually do it with SVG, and it's great if you do it inline like this. There are some drawbacks to doing this stuff. One is that it's a little bit more complex. So as you might imagine, just looking at the code, you're having to deal with all of this markup here, and it has to be correct. There's ways to mitigate some of this complexity. So I think in another example, let's see if I can find it. I actually created kind of individual React components here that are my SVG files, and then I just simply reuse this elsewhere in the page. So here you can see in this function, I'm just reusing icon 1, 2, and 3, 1, 2, and 3. These were actually these set of misaligned icons right here, but you do still need to manage all of this code in your code base, so it does increase complexity a little bit. All right, so that's everything that I wanted to show in terms of usage. There's a few things in here that I did want to talk about. I was going to touch on icon fonts and also some of those tools that I had mentioned earlier, like Svgo. But before I do that, I'll pause again just for a moment, just to see if anybody has any questions or comments, anything else that maybe I missed. James, if you feel like you want to chime in.
I can't think of anything. I guess one of my questions would be how people would export from Sketch or Figma in the best way for the devs. Do they just use the native export tools? I know there's Svgo plugins for Sketch, for example, and there are also online kind of converters you can use too. So yeah, it'd be good to get your insights there.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a lot of different techniques for how to do this. And I think really it depends on the application that you're building, how you want to export the icons from design software and then import them into your application. So really, I think the best answer would be to kind of work with your engineering team to understand how they want to use the icons. And also what your design goals are. Because if you need to do complex things like this, it is going to require you to use an inline SVG, but maybe for some icons, it's more appropriate to use a sprite. And you'll need to kind of mix and match the techniques as appropriate, depending on the application that you're building. Having said that, again, there are lots of different ways to do this. I did want to point out one tool that I think is really interesting called SVGR. And that provides a couple of different ways for handling your SVG assets. One of the really interesting things that it does is given some SVG file, and this you can see was just exported from Sketch. It's not optimized. It has like title attributes and description attributes, which frankly are kind of useless in your real application. But you can use SVGR to run your icon through this process where it spits out a React component, which is really nice because this is incredibly similar to this right here, but it will automatically take your SVG source file and output this. It will generate it automatically. So now you don't have to maintain this by hand at all. You'll also notice that SVGR did run the SVG itself through Svgo. So you can see here the actual resulting SVG code is very, very small and it has been optimized. What's nice about using a tool like this is you don't need to do much when you export from design software. You can just take basically whatever it spits out, throw it into a directory, and use this tool to automatically create this kind of output, which would then be what actually gets used in your application. It does do some other different things that are a little bit more complex, but I think that this tool works really, really well. And what's nice is that it does handle the optimization for you automatically. However, in some cases, maybe it does make sense to do something slightly differently. Maybe this tool isn't appropriate. And in that case, there's Svgo, which you can use directly. This tool is super popular. It has tons of features, which are all detailed out here, all of the individual things that it can do, and you have fine-grained control over each of those. The reason that you might want fine-grained control is some of these rules, if you enable them, could kind of break your SVG rendering in subtle, interesting ways. So you do have the ability to kind of balance optimization versus fidelity to the original drawing. This is a little bit more complex to use, not too different. And there's tons of examples here. So like you had mentioned, there is a Sketch plugin. Somebody built a macOS app, which I think will allow you to just basically drag and drop SVG files in, and then it will spit out optimized SVG files out, which you could then put in your application and then use kind of these variety of different ways that I had outlined over here. Lots of options, including this Webpack Loader. The reason I mention this is because SVGR also has a Webpack Loader, which will do all of the stuff that SVGR does, plus run it through Svgo, which is quite nice. Bootstrap, for instance, going back to that, primarily uses the sprite technique, but I think they do actually, and this is true for most icon sets that you can download third-party, you actually get the individual SVG icons themselves, which if you want to do a degree of customization on them is quite nice. Bootstrap also details a couple of different ways to actually use them, some of which are a little bit more complex, such as base64 encoding them or weird stuff like that, but certainly available. Another thing to touch on too is icon fonts, which are super interesting. They're really nice because they're super robust. They have tons and tons of icons. There's a lot of them out there. Font Awesome is, I would say, probably the most popular. Certainly the biggest, or at least the biggest popular one. Thousands and thousands of icons that you can see here. They're really nice because they're incredibly easy to use. So you don't get kind of that drawback of using your SVGs inline like you do here. You use them just like you would, any kind of letter or set of letters in a font. It also makes it really easy to style them in that you can control the color really easily and then basic other styling properties. So here you're animating, I think it's probably the opacity of these individual icons. But one of the drawbacks of using an icon font is that you do need to serve the font, which can, in some cases, be quite large. And if you're serving other fonts, that might not work for your particular application. You also don't get the ability to do kind of complex animations and fine-grained control like you do here when you're using the SVG inline. So again, it really depends on what your design goals are, which technique you're going to use. But hopefully that kind of gives you a nice overview of all the various ways to use these things. And then the last thing I wanted to show was that there is actually a SVGO kind of web interface called Svg OMG, which is really nice. It allows you to, here's a demo, paste or upload an SVG file. You can see kind of the resulting optimized markup. Here, this is quite large because it's this complex animation. And then you can also play around with the various SVGO options, which again, if you enable a lot of these things, it could potentially increase or decrease the file size. It will make it more optimized, but you can kind of break the rendering of your SVG in kind of subtle, interesting ways. You also have the ability to control the degree to which this is optimized. It doesn't appear to really affect this particular illustration, but there is a balance here between how optimized you want to make the markup and it not breaking. And then the last little kind of fun thing that I wanted to throw in there too, I'll paste this article in the chat, but there was this recent article last month about the UX of Lego interface panels, and they talk about kind of icon design and balancing some of the stuff that James was talking about earlier between kind of a more simplistic icon and something more complex and trying to balance the kind of level of information encoded in there. It's a really fun read. I definitely recommend checking that out.
Brian, I wanted to jump in. This is Jason from New York.
Hey.
My previous client, I just literally swam in the Font Awesome ocean for about a month or so. So you do have the option to invoke Font Awesome as either a web font or as SVG replacements for the glyph that you want to put in there. You have minimal control, like spinning and opacity and all that stuff about the SVG replacements. And if you do have access to the Webpack configuration, you can tree shake out, you can shake out the glyphs that you're not using. So they're in production only. So there is a way to say, I'm only using 5 graphics out of the 5,000 icons that come with Font Awesome or whatever it is. Shake out the 4,900 and whatever, and don't deliver them to the browser. So you can use Webpack to actually customize that, but you're right in that you don't get full access to all the SVG goodness. You can only do a little bit of rotation and color changing.
Got it. Yeah, I think so. The style control would basically be the same level of control that you have with any other letter in a font. But that's really interesting. I didn't know that you could kind of tree shake out individual assets, which is really cool. So for the non-technical people in the audience, tree shaking is like a fairly new concept where when you build an application, if you're only using parts of a library, your final build would only include the parts that you're using. So, for example, there's a very popular kind of utility library called Lodash, which has a whole bunch of functions for doing common things. If you decide that you only need to use the from pairs function, that's the only part of this whole entire library of hundreds of functions that would end up in your build. So in Font Awesome, if you only want to use these 12 or 10 icons, those are the only icons that would end up in your app, not the other 8,000 or so that are available and probably in the individual font file that they offer. Or maybe it's broken up into a couple of font files, but you're talking about at least hundreds of icons in each one, and now you can break out the individuals, which is actually really nice and great for performance.
Yeah, the last thing I wanted to say was that, yeah, so this part was just going back to your animation part. So that this little play with our icons thing is great because you can stack them. So instead of, if you don't want to get your hands dirty with SVGs or you don't really want to like understand what's going on, you can stack the Font Awesome icons just the way you did just there. Sort of like they have a bit of overlay.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. I'm actually using some more advanced kind of CSS features here. I'm using blend modes, which is pretty common. I mean, you see it in design software all the time, but this actually exists in CSS now. So over here, you'll see I'm using mix blend mode darken for all of the path nodes inside of my SVG, which is what gives you this nice little color intersection between each one of these individual bubbles. So there really is quite a lot of power here in that you can style each individual aspect of your SVG with CSS. Cool. So that's everything that I wanted to show. I think from here on out, it would probably just be kind of Q&A. I don't know if anybody had any other questions or comments. Happy to offer, any other experiences that I might have if anyone has questions.
Yeah, I think this is more of a discussion point. This is Scott Sylvie. I'm in the DC office, for those of you who haven't met. So when it comes to, let's say we use something like Figma or Sketch as, fundamentally my discussion here is around the source of truth. So if we're using Sketch or Figma as the source of truth for SVG, then presumably if I'm building a React application or an Angular application or whatever, we don't want, the ideal solution would be basically anytime those icons change, we could like auto-generate the icon library, the SVG library to be consumed by the application. And then you mentioned things like, Webpack for tree shaking, and you can also use Webpack to like, if the SVGs are small enough, that's where you probably were showing the base 64 encoded version, so that instead of actually having to like make a request for an SVG, it would actually just get inlined into the final output. So is that really the overarching goal that we're talking about here, is how to get from an icon designed or a library of icons designed in Figma and ultimately into the browser? Or is this just more kind of a higher level, here's what SVGs are and how they work within, or icons are and how they work within modern web?
Probably somewhere in between. I think the idea of incorporating kind of this newish concept that's called design ops into your workflow is really, really interesting, and something that I haven't really had an opportunity to kind of explore really deeply yet. But I think this SVGR tool kind of touches on that concept in that the source of truth could be whatever your design software exports without you having to do any sort of manual tweaking of what's in here or manual steps of having to, let's say, copy paste this into like SVG OMG and then download it and then put it in your application. I think that you could probably automate the process a little bit. And I think it would be really interesting to try and uncover ways to truly automate that all the way from design software. So you don't have a manual step of selecting all the icons and then spitting them out and then hooking everything up together. I wonder if there's a way to automate that completely, where if you were to, let's say, save a file in Figma, it'll do all of that stuff for you. I don't know the degree to which that's possible, but I think the idea is really interesting, and it kind of falls under the idea of design ops, which again is kind of a new-ish concept, and I think it's interesting. It needs a little bit more exploration.
Yeah, so I've done this from the context of we're going to source control our SVGs, and then the rest of it, from SVGR onward in Webpack, to automate kind of the consumption of that within a modern web framework like React. But I haven't done anything with, and I'm certainly by no means a designer and know very little about Figma other than how to, navigate around and find things that I need to build. So that side of it is a bit of a black hole for me. But I think if there was a way, like I know Sketch, for example, had a Sketch app and, was trying to become a source of truth that could then integrate with, Git and integrate with like a UI. But I don't know where I'm sure Figma's, I know it's phenomenal. And I know in a client project I'm working on, we're actually using Figma to export tokens, design tokens that get source controlled, and then we build like all of our core styles, and both for CSS and then also the JavaScript themes on top of that. So I know there's some things that can be done with the Figma API, but yeah, I think if there was a workflow that could show from icon to browser, largely or fully autonomous, that'd be really rad.
Yeah, that would be cool. You're describing the dream. I think, yeah, with a bit of like exploration, we could probably get there. Cool. Well, I think that's about everything. Again, this storybook right here, I'm going to put this up in the Lab49 GitHub organization, and everybody can kind of take a look. I think it would be really kind of instructive for designers to kind of take a look and just see what it looks like when not only here in the story, like what you can do, but kind of what it looks like when you're actually using these in your applications. I think it would be a great way to kind of think through all of the different possibilities, and also think through the specific solutions for what you're trying to accomplish in terms of design. Because again, I think in any kind of really sophisticated application, you might be using a mix of these techniques. And I think it would be great to have a high-level understanding of kind of what those techniques are and the pros and cons.
That was great, Brian. Thanks for that.
Great.
I'm sure it went over the heads of some of the designers here, myself included, but not that much over our heads. It's really interesting to be able to upskill that side and understand it from a dev perspective, because that's really generally where the designer's job tends to end. We pass those over and the magic happens, and then it looks great, and it's nice to see behind the curtain a bit. From a design perspective,
I was going to say same thing from the other direction too, just being able to understand like all of the complexity and all of the like the level of effort to actually making sure that an icon looks really good, both conceptually, like the drawing is interesting and serves the purpose of the design, but that it was constructed correctly too. Yeah.
And I think it would be great if any designers here currently working in Sketch or Figma, maybe with some of the insights, maybe you already knew all this stuff, but it'd be great to to be able to apply this, have a look at the icons in the current project you're working on, turn on the pixel rendering and have a look and just make sure they're all looking good and they've got correct bounding boxes and stuff, and we can start sort of tackling this as part of our process. Does anyone else have any input or questions or insights or examples of issues they've had? No. Okay, well, I've shared my links in the chat here. There's a link to the presentation file that I put together, and then there's the various links within that I've pulled out and stuck in the chat. You're gonna share your links.
Yep, I will.
And then Brian and I are going to try and figure out how we can get this into a more shareable format. Obviously, we've got this recording. We may create some kind of blog post. We still don't have the actual blog. We've been having website meetings about how we can share this stuff and share the skills of the practice to the wider world, which is a kind of another ongoing conversation. But these workshops, I think, are going to be really suited to providing that content, and showing that lab, we know what we're doing. So yeah, we'll try and figure that one out. If anyone else wants to present at these monthly things, please put your hand up. I don't want it just be myself and Brian going forward. But otherwise, we will. I'm sure there's plenty of topics that we can talk about at length. Animations, color, typography. Yeah, there's tons. I've touched on grids, but yeah, there's a whole load. But if anyone else wants to put their hand up and present something, anything related to design and dev. Yeah, hi Jason.
Sorry, I sorry, I thought there was a period there. I actually have a question for the designers. So I'm an engineer, obviously, and I do as best I can to move graphics into place and make them look as pretty as possible. Current client has a stylized glyph, let's just say a quotation mark. They're using a PNG. What's the easiest way for me to sort of turn it into an SVG, or is it not even worth it if it's a small glyph in that way? Because according to what the rubric of this, the parameters of this conversation is, stop making your graphics look crappy by having subpixel bleeding and all that stuff. This graphic happens to not be sharp and it does not fit into the pixel lines. So as a developer, where do I start? How do I take this graphic and vectorize it, I guess?
So that's a pretty interesting question. I think there's a lot of different ways to do it. My own kind of personal technique for something like that would be to actually draw it using the pen tool in design software. For something simple like a quote mark, that's probably where I would start. There are tools out there for kind of automatically tracing images. So like one of the really popular features of Illustrator is doing that automatic tracing. It's often not perfect and does require some hand tuning, especially if it's a complex image. But that would probably be the way that I would go, is just drawing it myself by hand. And then also converting it to SVG could potentially have some minor performance improvements in that the file size could actually be quite a lot smaller than a PNG. Plus, it will also be infinitely scalable. What's interesting, too, about something like that quote mark is it's a little further away from an icon and more kind of on the spectrum closer to like an illustration. So you do get to not have to concern yourself quite so much with all of the anchors being on a full pixel, because if the presentation of that illustration was large enough, you're not going to have those issues of it looking blurry or broken like you would at really compact, small sizes that
Right.
icons are presented with,
Right,
or present
right.
at.
I'd like to add a comment to that, because depending on who the client is and how strong their branding team is, I would not recommend redrawing things without talking to them first. Because
Oh, yeah, no,
you're
I'm-
liable to encounter people who are very sensitive about that.
Excellent
I'm
point.
definitely not going to. I just wanted to bring it up as like, what if?
Yeah,
Yeah.
my starting point there would be to contact their UX people and see if they can export it in a different format, because
Mhm.
chances are they can.
That's a great idea. Okay.
Yeah, that's actually interesting too, because that, I mean, we're getting further away from icons now, but if it is a quotation mark and it's based on some typeface, there are ways of converting the typeface to outlines, which can then be easily exported to SVG. If you don't do that, you're not able to export it as an SVG, which might be why the asset is a PNG to begin with. But most software will allow you to, it's usually called convert to outline, and it will convert all of the letter shapes to paths. So it's no longer the typeface, it's now just vector paths, which interestingly, now I'm really diverging, is what you're supposed to do as a designer. Like if you're doing something where you're using a typeface where you've paid for a license, before you send it to like print, for instance, you are supposed to convert everything to outlines so that you're not passing around the font file.
Cool. I learned something. Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, great. So if there aren't any more questions, I guess that's a wrap.
Cool. All right. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, guys. That was great.
See you at the next
Thanks.
one. Like I say, if
Yep.
anyone wants to put their hand up, please do. Cheers.
Yeah.
Bye.
See you, Brian.